next framework program. So this is the workshop on connected health. Can big data help us live healthier, longer, better? We have a prominent panel of very different people who will, in a quite complementary way, address this issue, these questions we are raising for today. And of course, we will start with Kerstin Kuhls, who is an expert in foresight. She is working in the Fraunhofer Institute for Systems and Innovation Research. After having done studies, I understood a double training in Japanese and Chinese studies, but then you did also a business and administration studies, and you specialize in foresight. You did in foresight studies in concerning Japan, and in relation, of course, with technology, and that's why she's here, because she is also member of several panels of the European Commission, starting by the European Forum of Forward-Looking Activities. She is member of the high-level group RISE, and she is member of the group working with Nikos Kastrinos on the foresight concerning health. So she will present us the health democratic study she did for the Commission. Thank you very much, Kerstin, for being here with us today.
Yes, hello. So the expectations are high, I guess. But I do not want to talk too much about a study in health. I'm also in the Bohemia project. So I'm more from the conceptualization point of view, bringing some first aspects of the Bohemia. And you've already seen what Matthias was telling you, that we have a first kind of scenarios that are more broad. We have two paths, two trajectories of different scenarios, the perseverance scenarios, and something that can make things better. But scenarios are not only black or white, good or not so good, or wrong. They are consistent in themselves. And they are different traits, and so that we have different paths gathered also in health to two scenarios that will be put into the Delphi survey, broken down, but also, of course, fed with different topics from the Delphi later on, and which will lead to further discussions. So these scenarios are just a starting point for knowledgeable, intelligent people to fill them with life, to test them, to criticize them, to challenge them. And this is the first scenario. And this scenario is the business as usual perseverance scenario. And here we see a lot of inequalities. And the inequalities, as far as we see it now, are not diminished. They are increasing. We have a lot of inequalities in access to healthcare, compound with income inequalities, inequalities associated with social status, with a place of residence, and with the country you're coming from. And that means, if it's going on like this, smart cities can become highly desirable places to live, because there you have everything for your health, for your long life. You are also, and all these facilities are also priced into the property markets. What is clear is that the number of centenarians is increasing. Currently, it's really, extrapolating, it's really exploding, the number. We have a number of individuals enjoying important health and performance enhancements. So we have prosthetics, we have artificial organs, we have genetic treatments, whatever, in this scenario, but not everyone can afford it. And in this scenario, we have more and more discontent with those people, or in those people groups who cannot afford it, and that can even persist and deepen up to health riots. People really protesting against it. First scenario. Sounds very disappointing. The second one is about health fairness. How can we do it that we are fair in the whole EU? That means equity in access to health services and the treatments as a reality in the whole of Europe. We will have, in these scenarios, a lot of breakthroughs in treatments and in genetic diseases, and they are relevant for everyone. We have an emphasis more on good lifestyles, on prevention, and these have already an effect in this scenario in 2040 around that. They will already reduce the health costs, and the budgets can be reduced, prevent these budgets, our health budgets, from exploding. And through big data, we have a dynamic healthcare system that learns in real time, so that everything can be fed back quite quickly. Wide accessible personal nutrition advice, that improves really the outcomes, but people have to listen to that. We know a lot already, but people have to be made that they really listen to that. And through R&I investments and appropriate business models for the pharmaceutical sector, the EU, the European Union, leads the world in prevention technologies for health. We have a lot of other things like defeated antimicrobial resistance, personalized vaccination, and the gap between the life expectancy and the healthy life expectancy is narrowed. Our industrial players implement the strictest health norms in the world, and the EU uses its leadership position to foster health all around the world, globally. I know that many will think this scenario is too positive, but that's why you're here, to criticize and give us feedback. Feedback is welcome on this in any form. And if any of you would like to participate in the Delphi survey, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kerstin. This was a very interesting starting point for our panel. Maybe there are questions in the room for Kerstin? How would you propose, Kerstin, to address this problematics of dividing into the, maybe even in 3 levels, the health, access to health care in Europe?
Currently, we have most of the costs in the high-tech health sector. So we should also address more the in-between innovations, those innovations that are not high-level, high costs, or decrease the high-tech costs, also by research, by doing science and research, and to bring them to the larger market so that people really have access to these innovations that are cheaper, and that they need to be linked much more to those people who really need it. Often people don't know how they can really get these kind of treatments, enhancements, whatever, even if they could afford it. Or we also need some funds on different levels that don't have to do with science and technology to prevent that.
What can the next framework program do for that?
You mean the framework program?
Because you mentioned funds.
That's not for the framework program here. That would be for other programs that would be outside. In the framework program, one can stick a lot to frugal innovations or innovations that are in between high level, that are innovations, also social innovations, in between the real science system in health, in medicine, and prevention, and find out how the people really behave. Because that is often different to what scientists expect.
Yeah. I see that Professor Nayers, you have a comment for Kerstin. Maybe you have the, I think, the micro on yourself.
Right. Can you hear me? Right. So I thought the divvying up the problem into 2 scenarios was really great, and I learned a lot. Just one comment maybe on the fairness scenario, your preferred scenario. You make an assumption that prevention leads to healthier lives and therefore reducing cost. I don't think that is borne out by experience and the past, because people may be healthier and they may be living up to, say, 100 years old, but then in the last 5 years they will still get the same diseases. Their major cancer that needs a major operation, their hip replacement, and so on and so forth. I think it's slightly courageous to give the politicians the illusion that things will get cheaper. The partition between costs will change, but it won't get any cheaper.
This is a question I will maybe pick up a bit later about the costs related to these health questions.
And for the program, I think we need a study on that, a very big study that really looks into that question, because you all hear it all along, and I think it's a fallacy, but I can't prove it.
Yeah,
We need to study it.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe we'll be passed to the next speaker, James Elsby, who is the head of the European R&D business at Pfizer. So I know that you have been working quite a lot on evaluating, negotiating new alliances and cooperations for your company, in particular in relation with biotechs, but also universities and other corporations. And you have also some experience now with IMI as one of the European, I would say, flagships somehow, with all the big pharma firma in Europe involved. So maybe your turn to tell us in 2-3 minutes your point of view. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monica. So yes, I've taken on the role of heading up Pfizer's IMI office, and it's very interesting to see how that has evolved and the opportunities that presents. What we're really seeing is digital healthcare and big data is really at the cusp of a new wave of innovation and opportunity. And it's really, how do we make sure that Europe is at the forefront of that? We really have a situation where we've got a lot of diverse stakeholders involved. It's very complex. Digital healthcare in that big data space is certainly lagging behind other areas and other sectors. But that's those diverse stakeholder groups. We've got patients, we've got payers, we've got regulators, we've got society, more generally academia. All those need to be actually addressed, and managing all the issues associated with that. What is their different value propositions? How do we make sure that we're dealing with the regulatory issues, the legal issues, the ethical issues associated with that? These are all things that we need to get our head around. Providing frameworks that allow us to actually engage those different groups together in setting a problem statement, getting them talking together and actually identifying how they can actually address some of those issues, I think is going to be absolutely critical. So Europe has got a real opportunity here to actually really start to lead in this space. I think digital healthcare provides a real growth area. I think we all expect it's going to be absolutely a massive opportunity going forward. And it's going to drive benefits both for economies, for businesses, and for patients and society. So how do we make sure Europe's at the center of that? I think it's through partnership. I think we've got a lot of frameworks already in place in Europe through things like IMI, where we already have an understanding of how to partner together very effectively. So make sure that we choose the right projects going forward, and then we start to think about how do we actually put those teams together that are aligning their particular efforts on a overall goal, recognizing that there's different value propositions coming out of that each of them want to pursue. But if we can align actual efforts on outcomes towards what's the benefit to patients and society and to the economy, then we can hopefully make some progress and making sure that Europe stays at the forefront.
Thank you very much, James. I have a question. Does IMI fund some projects on how to use the digital technologies and big data for this kind of approaches?
Yeah, so we're seeing more evolution into that space now. So there's a new calls coming through called Big Data for Better Outcomes. So there's various projects that are ongoing with the Big Data for Better Outcomes. They're just doing a coordination support action and some individual projects looking at certain disease areas as well, how to use those frameworks. So it's definitely an area that's going to be expanding further. There's also Project CNS Radar and Web Radar. Web Radar is a fascinating project looking at how does patients and social media put out data, and how do you actually then collate some of those inputs and actually try to make sense of it, and developing that overall database. So how do we actually interact more broadly rather than very controlled data? There's a huge amount of data that's out there. So I think IMI can serve a very useful purpose, or a new generation of whatever IMI evolves to.
Of course, one of the challenges will be also to guarantee the quality of the data and the security of those data.
Yeah, and I think that's something that, from a European perspective, I think, again, we can be leaders on ensuring that the data that goes out to patients, out to the regulators, out to businesses, is of a high standard. It's rich data, it's quality data, and people are actually generating meaningful results from that and getting, you know, good opinion, rather than, you know, the quack research that's out there and people relying on that.
Okay, thank you. So this helps me to go to the next speaker, which is Jane Kay. Thank you very much for having accepted to be with us today. I think you will bring in another perspective or another insight to this discussion. And because we mentioned the problematics of quality of data, maybe you, with your experience as lawyer, you are director of the Center for Law, Health and Emerging Technologies, HELEX, if
Yes.
I understood well, at the University of Oxford. And your research, you are doing research, in fact,
Yes.
which people always think lawyers are only something else, but you are doing research which focuses on the relationships between law, ethics, which I thought is really an added value to this discussion panel, and the emerging technologies in health, of course. So thank you very much, Jane.
Thank
Your
you.
turn.
So in my research centre, we're really looking at the implications of new technologies in health. And over the last 6 months, we've seen the introduction of CRISPR and the fact that you can now buy a kit online so that you can actually edit your genome. The possibilities of science to actually affect individuals is really important. And I think what we need to do is to start thinking about healthcare that is integrated, that brings the clinic as well as research together and actually puts individual citizens at the centre of decision making and empowers them to make decisions about how data flows and how they can actually get involved in research. I think we have a real a democratic deficit within Europe. We're not really going out to people and really involving them in a whole range of activities, but also involving them in a meaningful way in healthcare delivery, but also in research. And so I think what technology will enable, and digital technologies will enable people to become more active, but also we need to be thinking about the social implications. What are society's expectations about the introduction of new technologies, and how do we meet those expectations so that technology is not just being developed in a vacuum and really not being taken up by citizens and broader society. So I really think that we need to take some lessons from what has happened in personalised medicine and to think very clearly about how we address these ELSI implications, so the ethical, legal and social implications of personalised medicine initiatives. So what we've seen over a number of years, starting with the Human Genome Project and moving towards the personalised medicine approach in the US, but also projects such as the 100,000 Genome Project in the UK, is how social science research is embedded within large scientific projects as an equal partner. And this has meant that we've seen the development of infrastructure that have really promoted innovation, have promoted data sharing, but in a way that is in conformity with social expectations, within the norms of civil society, but also in compliance with legal requirements. So I think we really need to basically think about the mindsets that mean that we don't involve citizens and actually think more creatively about how we promote flows of data to enable innovation and how citizens can bring their experiences of disease and their energies into that endeavour.
Thank you very much. This raises for me already several questions. One is, do you think, well, I understand from your presentation and also the discussion we had before this event that in fact health has been dealt with in a very paternalistic way, you said to me.
Yes.
And that's why we need to involve much more the citizens, and before they are sick, by the way, even the ethical questions should be in fact answered before we are in a difficult situation, if you can comment on that.
Yes, I really think that's very important. I think that we need to understand the important ethical, legal and social issues as the science is developing. We can't start developing regulatory frameworks after the event. We need to make sure that our law and our regulatory frameworks are more responsive to change, but also that they're very much involving citizens. And I think we haven't managed to do that. And that really is the challenge of the future. How we engage citizens in science through citizen science projects, through new ways of bringing them into debates and discussions.
That means also that there should be more research in social science and humanities. You said they should be embedded in the other, but for being embedded, they have to exist by themselves as full recognized research fields.
Yes.
You can comment on that.
Absolutely. So, you know, within socio-legal research, which is one of the areas that I specialise in, there is a whole agenda of important questions that we're developing, changes in methodologies to use digital technologies. And so all of that work then feeds into our collaborations in scientific projects. So it's very much that you need to have a very well-developed social science and humanities research platform in order to make sure that we are really addressing social concerns about new technologies in health.
Do you think there were enough budget for these fields of research in social science and humanities in Horizon 2020? Should there be more in the future?
I think there should be more, and also I think it should be a requirement of, if there are large scientific projects, there should be ring-fence funding to look at the ELC issues. And that should be there. So there should be funding for ELSI research, but also funding within scientific projects.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Maybe there is somebody in the room who wants to ask a question. The micro is arriving.
Thanks. Tim Softley from the University of Birmingham. You mentioned the 100,000 genome project, and the technology already, or pretty much already exists to, where we're in a situation where, the sort of goal of having a $1,000 genome in 20 minutes, Oxford Nanopore technology, we're not far off from that situation. So you could imagine a situation in the future where just as now, when you walk into an optician, they say, have you had your photographs of your retina taken, or you walk into a dentist and they take x-rays of your teeth. You walk into your general practitioner who says, have you had your genome taken yet? And we jump 10 years forward, we could be in it wasn't envisaged in your scenario planning, but one could, vast swathes of the population in Europe could have had their genome taken, if that's what we want. I think the question is that what we want?
So I think that's a really good question, and I think it's really depending what you envisage with that sequence information. There's the Global Health Alliance, which is bringing together large data sets of sequence data and clinical data, because then clinicians who have patients with rare variants can say, well, actually, is there anyone else out in the world who have patients who have this variant? So you can get real comparisons, which can really aid individual patients. I think we need to really understand what social expectations are. The empirical work that we carry out shows time and time again that people are really happy to be involved in research. They're happy to allow researchers to have access to their sequence data. but they're very concerned about the fact that it might then become a basis for marketing. It might become, they're very concerned about commercial access to that data, and we need to really address these concerns. Because, as you know, in the UK, we've had some real disasters in terms of trying to basically utilise the data that's being gathered through the healthcare system, through care.data, which basically resulted in a whole initiative falling foul because of patient outcry. So I think it depends what we want to do with that data. I think we want sequence data if it means it's going to have real benefits for individuals and the wider population. I don't think we've really explored fully how genomics can have real benefits for population health. And so I think there's enormous potential for using this data, but we need to do it in a way that is in alignment with individual and social expectations.
Is there any other question in the room? Otherwise, I will come back to you, Jane, afterwards about the legal frame we need also in this context.
Okay.
But I will pass the word to Professor Ludwig Kneises, who is currently Vice President of the Research University of Luxembourg. You are a renowned professor in medicine and cardiology, and your research is now focusing on mechanisms of treatment and common conditions such as hypertension and health failure. But I know you have a very large experience. You have been working in Europe, in US, so maybe you have some particular insights to tell us about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I just ask start by asking how many physicians who actually see patients are in the room? One, and myself. That is already one of the problems for all the framework programs. The physicians are not interested enough in policy setting and so on, because they are busy with usually their patients or patients and research, but also policy makers do not seek their advice. So that is a very major problem that I think needs to be remedied. What if you sit in front of a patient, assuming she or he has a severe disease? What are the three questions that they're going to ask? They aren't particularly bothered whether you share, if you have cancer, how can you be bothered whether your physician shares your data with somebody? That may be true for a few politicians, but not for everybody in the street. So first question, how long have I got to live? Second question, how good? In other words, what will my quality of life be? And third question, how are you going to treat me? That is what patients want to know. And so what should we do in terms of the future program? One was prognosis. How long have I got to live? What we need is 1A, the clinical phenotyping needs to be far improved. We say somebody has heart failure if there is dysfunction of the heart, which I'm not going to go into, and they have symptoms of heart failure. So just give you one, which is simple, the ankle swelling. But nobody knows how to quantify ankle swelling. And there is no way, there's rough ways of quantification, but they're completely useless to be put into databases. And that is very difficult to do. Dyspnea, shortness of breath, very difficult to quantify, and therefore, if you put nonsense into databases, of course you get nonsense out, even if you correlate that with sequencing and so on and so forth. So the clinical phenotyping is work to do. Why does nobody want to do it? Because it's considered to be boring and you can't publish it in the big papers, in the big journals. That's a very big problem. Second is, my second question was prognosis, or 1B for prognosis. Prognosis by definition is, or research on prognosis takes many, many years. 5, 10, 20 years. If you have cancer of the breast, for example, what you really want to know, how long am I going to live? And so we must develop methods maybe to do guesswork on prognosis. And you've already mentioned one. If you look at 1 billion patients, for example, or 1 million for that matter, then you might be able to find 2 with the same cancer and the same progression, and then can work out, or not 2, say 100, and then can presumably work out what the prognosis is going to be. So we need methods to work out that question of prognosis. It is still a surrogate because we don't know whether that cross-sectional study will ever bear any reality in future, in 20 years or 30 years when all these people are dead. Second question was quality of life. Again, quality of life, so with the same heart dysfunction, for example, or the same cancer, your quality of life can be immensely different. Some people run around, they travel throughout the world, and others can't walk in their garden. So again, we need a correlation between the clinical status of those patients and the big data, as it is called, either sequencing or big social data or whatnot. And treatment, again, we've quite well advanced in treatment of cancer, where we do the cancer genome, and then for about 5 or 10% of the cancers, you can work out the drug that works best on that particular cancer genome. Number one, there is 90% others, so we need to go on working on that. But also, there is many diseases, of course, that are not cancer and where the genome probably doesn't play a role. So, for example, in my field, heart failure, or in people who have severe back pain, they may be invalidated by back pain. So what kind of data should we be looking for? Nobody knows. And I'll close by saying that everything we've talked about by now is more or less correlation. Big data are correlations with the diseases. What we really need in future, as in the past, is work on causality, pathophysiology. That has to be a very big point. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy that you ended on the physiology needs, because since many years I'm telling that there has been 0 money for this kind of research fields in the framework program. And I see it's really important to have it back in maybe in the future program. Maybe you want to comment a bit more on that, Ludwig.
Yes, so one field where pathophysiology and big data, of course, come together is the sequencing field. So in the sequencing field, you sequence a cancer, for example, you find typically a few hundred mutations in cancer tissue, and then the pathophysiology tries to work out what are just correlative mutations that don't have anything to do with the cancer origin, and what are the causal mutations. So that would be a typical question for pathophysiology. Of course, that is only the beginning. If you have the mutation, then you need to work out the pathway from the mutation to cancer growth. Because if you've worked out that pathway, you can hopefully find a drug that interrupts it and then therefore kill the cancer cell, and likewise in heart failure. So that's a very important example. But if big data are correlations, so if you correlate the cancer with 500,000 Chinese patients and American patients who have the same cancer, and then you work out the differences and so on, that's all correlation, that's never causality.
Yeah. Thank you very much. There is another item I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned at the start of your presentation the problematics, how many people are in the room who are practitioners or are physicians. One of the questions I'm asking myself since many years is, how can we do to involve more and more? Is it like involving the patients or the citizens? How can we involve in health research or in health activities much more the practitioners. I have 2 doctors in my family, and always very sad that they have no means, in fact, to be involved, and they should be, because we have to bring them out of isolation. In some countries more than in others, by the way, in Europe.
I think there is 2 ways. Number one is to go to the biggest and the best university hospitals and try and convince them. Many physicians do have time and interest, so it's a question of the policymakers of actively approaching them. That's number one. The general physician everywhere would fall under your model of citizen. He's a citizen, or she, and those citizens would then take part and give their patient data, but they do need training for that. So they need time.
Absolutely, yeah.
And time is money, of course,
Yeah.
in medicine, as everybody knows. And then the citizen involvement is, when I was in Manchester, I did chief cardiology in Manchester for 12 years, we did try citizen involvement and so on, and that works quite well. I think one has to be realistic. It's a tiny layer of the population that is interested and able to be involved, because 90% of the patients still prefer the paternalistic model. If you give them the choice between 2 treatments and you say that has a chance of a side effect of 30% and the other one of 40%, only 8% of the population study, only 8% of the population understand the concept of probability. So it's very difficult.
Jane, do you want to
Yeah,
comment?
I do want to come in there. So a couple of times, I think we're still developing this idea of how we engage citizens or patients. And so citizen science is very much a niche area, which is about citizens being able to set the agendas. And we've seen that with the AIDS epidemic, how patients really got involved and kind of set the research agenda. But also, I think something that has come out of your talk is actually how much we need to document and get an understanding of patients' experience of disease. And so to really build that clinical phenotype, because currently we are putting a framework on that which has come from clinical practice. And maybe the experience of disease can actually help inform how we develop treatment regimes. Yes. So I think there's great potential to use technologies to do that. And so we're starting to pilot some of those things at Oxford. And what we found is that people are really prepared to be involved. I do take your point, is how much that goes out to the wider population, and it really depends on their condition. And if you are in the final stages of a disease, then it's very, very different from where you are someone who is, sort of at a stage of life where you have good health. But I think we need to understand how we can actually, use tracking devices to develop people's digital phenotypes, and how all of those things can actually give us the data which can really inform and enrich our knowledge base to actually develop new treatment possibilities.
I agree. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I will now pass the word to François Nicolas. Thank you very much for being here. François is ex-vice president of Diabetes and Cardiovascular Integrated Care at Sanofi. And he is responsible currently for the development of solutions that combine drugs, medical devices, digital health, and care devices to deliver best possible treatment. And what is interesting, you certainly will comment, is that you are now in this partnership with the ex-Google initiative on life science, which was called Verily, and with this partnership, which is called Ondo. So maybe you can comment on that. Thank you very much.
Sure. So perhaps I can start with a few comments on the innovation aspect to deliver on the fairness scenario that you talked about. So there is innovation in technologies. Big data can be used to train algorithms that help personalize coaching or treatment, genetics, whatever. But what I wanted to maybe highlight is the innovation in the implementation of those new techniques is extremely important as well. And quite often we have in research discovered elements that are actually not used in the clinic. And why is that? Is something that I think we should be looking into. One element of that is how is not drug, but healthcare paid for, how it's reimbursed. Right now, we have a very piecemeal approach. We have, for example, reimbursement for drugs, reimbursement for devices, for prevention, for care services, etc. With new approaches that are a bit more integrated, more holistic, there's a potential to deliver value in different ways. Perhaps a digital intervention is going to be better than a drug intervention for specific patients. And that needs to be taken into account. So I think there is a need for innovation on the assessment of the value that is delivered with different interventions. And this is where big data can be extremely helpful to deliver this real-time healthcare system that learns, as you were saying. And another kind of remark on the innovation aspect is, I find it striking that digital health is booming, but most companies, when they want to scale, they go to the US. That's really when they start about scaling. And why is that? I mean, Europe, there are many people. So how can we, at the policy level, ensure or help or foster the implementation of innovation in Europe? Because the reality is the market in the US is seen as easier to penetrate. It's one language, one country, one regulatory process. Well, there are many elements that are already in place in Europe, and I think thinking about how to incentivize innovation. So, for example, making the link with the reimbursement topic. So, if we had ways, or let's say a data infrastructure to evaluate different approaches, whether they work or don't work, and if we had ways to incentivize industry to try their solutions in Europe, but then those solutions that actually work would stay, and the solutions that don't work because they don't reduce the cost long term, as you were saying, would be eliminated. But incentivizing that with the right data infrastructure to evaluate might help bring innovation to Europe in terms of the implementation. And just to address your earlier questions about, so my current role, I am involved in the initiation of a joint venture that we created with Google Life Sciences. So Verily is their spin-off. It's called, it was Google Life Sciences, and we created a joint venture between Sanofi and Verily that's called OnDuo. The aim of this joint venture is to develop new solutions using digital health, using care services, providing holistic approaches to try to have an impact on reduce long-term cost and improve quality of life for diabetes and related chronic conditions. So that's the let's say the bet that Sanofi and Google have made together to explore this field.
Thank you very much. On this last point, that means that these are very multidisciplinary partnerships, which need really very, very large, different complementary competencies. Yeah. Is this the case? Yeah.
Oh, no, definitely. I mean,
how could the next framework program address this better, the multidisciplinarity? Because it's always this discussion: is it interdisciplinarity? Is it transdisciplinarity? Is multi? We will not discuss it today, but how could we open even more, and how could the evaluation systems address it better? Maybe we need tailored systems to evaluate the projects, the proposals, so that this kind of projects are captured and funded.
For the translational aspects, or those that are close to market, I tend to believe that if we organize the market well, players will organize themselves and will come. Versus trying to organize the players. So it's not about designing the solutions that are going to work. Nobody knows. We just have to try. But what is important, in my view, is to have a very clear, transparent, and fair way to evaluate them, so that we don't, create biases. Yeah. And then players will get organized.
You are addressing what was discussed a bit earlier today, is this bottom-up versus top-down. This would mean a more bottom-up approach. That means
bottom-up, but yet with a top-down legal, regulatory, health economic framework. I think the framework is extremely important. Otherwise, it's just going to be, who has the biggest voice, or those kind of things that are going to create biases, and it's not going to deliver the value that we expect.
Yeah. I see the time is running, and I would like to raise still some questions, but maybe in the room somebody has questions over there, and a lady over there. two questions.
Well, I guess working. What has been addressed in part by you in terms of if a patient has a fatal disease, maybe she or he is not in a position like to have a likelihood discussion. But on the other hand, we get a phenomenon of having more and more patient emancipating and using this flood of data for their own advantage. I was yesterday at a symposium organized by Johnson & Johnson, and some patients were reporting who, for example, optimize their treatment in certain chronic diseases, and it turns out in participating in this, they really had a better life quality. And it even came up at the end of the day, maybe the drugs of the next generation, you include patients in defining the endpoint. So I guess data flood creates a lot of possibility for individuals, and some individuals, Dr. Nices, I agree with you, they may not like to do it, and they rather like to have advice. But we should really see this will change the relationship between doctors and patients dramatically.
Oh, that is changing. So in my heart failure patients, I had a very large heart failure clinic. I involved them in dosing their own diuretics and so on. So the water drugs, as they say. It's just what I'm trying to say is that is not many. If you have 100 heart failure patients, maybe you can do that in 10, and that's on a good day. These patients, I mean, of course, they're also elderly, sometimes have cognitive problems and so on. That's what I was trying to say. But I'm not against the principle, and actually we are doing it. In the university hospitals, most physicians who know something about those things, they have started that for a long time.
If I can just add a comment, I think the next generations are also being different in that approach, so they might become much more proactive in that field and participative, so we have to take it into account. Unfortunately, time is running, and I wanted just to raise some questions about, there is a question over there that I don't forget. The lady,
I had
please.
one question. It's really a general question about big data and where we should focus on the future. And the question is to the IMI representative. Obviously, the pharma industry have decided to put big data into one of their topic areas. What was the conversation around within the pharma industry? Where should you focus? Because it's a big question for the future that I don't see people focusing in on.
So I think you've honed in on one of the major issues here, that big data for better outcomes is a huge initiative. So there is a whole framework about how do we actually collate the data, how do we manage that data, how do we start to think about correlating the data, translating the data, and actually making sense of that data. So from big data, you can also get a lot of big noise. So how do we actually make sure that we're actually focusing on real data and generating positive value from that? So I think a lot of the projects are going to be generating a lot of that type of thinking, as how do they manage a lot of the disease-specific situations, how do they do research and try to really tease out what is genuine, what is something that you can actually make proper decisions on. But then thinking, how do we actually, a lot of these projects are also getting very involved in bringing the ethical considerations into the discussion right from the start, bringing patient advocacy groups into the discussions right from the start, trying to think about what is the downstream impact of that. So it's a really broad plethora of things starting to be thought about.
Time is running. I'm unfortunately can only take one question, but I see that Kerstin wants to react on this comment.
I just want to add something from the foresight point of view, that a lot of these data are also used for predictive things. So as prediction of what could occur if I'm affected by a certain disposition to a disease or to something else. So also this predictive aspect needs a lot of regulation already. We have the Angelina Jolie case where a lot of people followed that because there is an idol already following these kind of listening to big data, listening to the predictive part of big data, and that has really a huge ethical impact. And this also needs to be considered a lot when people deal with big data, because there are very different databases and very different ways of using these databases in the future. Not only now already, but even more in the future.
Thank you. There was one question over there, but unfortunately I'm reminded the time is passing, so please.
Jan van den Biesen from Philips. I just want to mention yet another initiative that we are developing a data platform for health that will be open for third parties to use, that will connect all these separate data silos from along the health continuum, from healthy living to prevention, early diagnosis, treatment, and also recovery and aftercare at home, to allow big data analytics, but also to support clinical decision making and improve therapy.
Thank you. So big data is about also having the infrastructure, having the legal frame, the ethical frame, the quality control. I will stop because time is passing. I'm told that we have no time anymore, so it's very frustrating. I had a huge list of questions myself. I would have loved to ask to the panel, but I want to thank the panel. I want to thank your participation for being there. Thank you very much. Please do not hesitate to come and ask the questions you have on your heart.
Let's turn off my mic.
Finally, I couldn't ask the last question, which is what are the 6 bullets to be retained for the plenary? Exactly, so it's quite late.
Leave a party when it's best. So I think that's what we've done. You should. I think it's good.
It is always very frustrating.